Well, I'll tell you what, before we kick into our second panel of the morning, just a couple administrative notes. First of all, again, thank you so much to our sponsors for helping us put on the event. And we'll have another round of applause in the afternoon as well. And secondly, I'm looking at the tables and I see all those yellow critique sheets. If you could please do us a favor, assuming that you're not burning them for warmth right now, if you could please be sure to fill those critique forms out, and it would help us greatly. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the honors over here to Tony Fazio from the FAA, who's going to talk about a very important follow-on topic to our foundational panel this morning, and that's the appropriate use of information. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Sean, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present this panel today. As we heard this morning, the new buzzword in our society is big data. We heard it somewhat this morning. We will hear it in other segments of our society. We all know that good things can come from big data, right? If anyone's been on the internet recently and has purchased something from Amazon or from one of the big retailers, you know that big data helps you weave through that system. But we also know the downsides, right? We know the privacy protections that are at jeopardy. Using that data in ways we might not want. For those of you in the United States, know that several government agencies have been in the press for a number of years now, it seems, for the use of data. So what I'd like to do is take our panel in a little different direction, and I'd like to thank the previous panel for not going in depth in some of our topics. I was scribbling notes in the back saying, oh my gosh, they took my questions away from me. But I think what we'll do is, for those of folks who did ask those questions, we'll go a little further in depth on those issues. Because there's a lot that has been done, there's a lot being done, and a lot still needs to be done. And we're going to touch all of those with this prestigious little panel here. But before we do, let me just quickly introduce everyone. As everyone met, we met John Illson. Let me just add to John's repertoire that he has been very instrumental in the SMS activities at the FAA and was the secretariat who led us through the Safety Information Protection Panel at ICAO. And I will ask he and Ken Quinn, who was the co-chair of that panel, to elaborate a bit further, because I think many of you may not be aware of what ICAO is doing in this area. To Ken's left is David Deveau, who's with Jazz Airlines in Canada. We're going to use David to help walk us through some of his experience in SMS programs in Canada. As you know, Canada has been at the forefront of adopting SMS programs. And to his left is Juan Carlos Lozano, who is with IFALPA, and will bring to us the perspective of the international airline community and the international associations in these areas. So, as the title of the session is called, Safety Occurrence Reports, Use and Misuse, I think we heard a lot about the use of the data, and you're going to hear this afternoon some of the benefits that we've been able to garner out of using this data. So as I said, I'd like to focus more on perhaps the misuse of the data. But before we do, I'm going to open it up to each of the panelists to give us kind of their views on what do you see as the greatest benefits and the greatest risks to the misuse of the data and the use of the data. So John, you want to start from an international perspective?
Thanks, Tony, and good morning again, everyone. So just to pick up on Tony's introductory questions, the greatest benefit, I think, is related to the title of this meeting or this conference, is the ability to proactively identify and address safety issues, and that's the direction ICAO certainly is going. If you're not familiar terribly with our structure, our documentation, we have 19 annexes to the Chicago Convention now. The 19th annex is dedicated to safety management, which includes both the state safety program at the national level and also the safety management systems at what we call the service provider level, which would include the airlines, air navigation service providers, training organizations, maintenance organizations, et cetera. And so it's a complementary system that is fundamentally based on the availability of data that feeds this proactive and analytic process. And whether it's reported or recorded through FOCA programs or other types of information, Hassan Shahidi mentioned ADS-B data and surveillance data as well. This can create a holistic capability to analyze risks within the international air transportation system and is extremely beneficial. The risks are that the information could in some ways be misused. And so I think I'll give you just a bit of context from, so that you can understand how we got to where we are at ICAO in our efforts. Tony mentioned the Safety Information Protection Task Force. That is a group of 55 experts representing 27 different countries and international organizations. And it was a multidisciplinary group that involved safety management expertise, such as I think Tony's type of background and area of work, legal experts, as well as accident investigation experts. And the idea was to create this group that would develop general principles and legal standards for the protection of safety information. We formed that group in January 2010, and it worked very intensely for over 3 years. Ken Quinn, the vice chair of the Safety Information Protection Task Force, under his leadership, as well as leadership of Dr. Jonathan Alec from Australia. And it created some what are really very important recommendations and delivered those recommendations to ICAO over a year ago now. And again, as we have to respect the sovereignty of each of our member states, it creates a challenge. How do we create standards that would require states to protect safety information in a particular way, given the different legal systems, cultures, et cetera, regulatory frameworks within each of those countries? And what the task force, I won't talk about the details of the provisions. I'll leave that to Ken. He's going to explain it much better than me. But those provisions have been delivered, recommendations have been delivered to us in the Secretariat. We've been coordinating them throughout ICAO over the last year or so, along with the Safety Management Panel, who has developed Annex 19 itself. And that's a very complex process. When Tony asked me when we had a telecon the other week about what it is I expected to talk about today, I told him that I expected to give this group the latest news as to the Air Navigation Commission's decision as to the disposition of those recommendations from the task force. Unfortunately, that meeting with the Air Navigation Commission, which was supposed to have taken place last Tuesday, is scheduled for tomorrow. So I can't give you that answer, and even more unfortunately, I have to get back on an airplane tonight, be in Montreal first thing in the morning, and then come back for the second conference this week. So I will have news. I don't this week, although I don't have it today. But just to say that tomorrow's a pivotal date for us, the culmination of 3 years' worth of work from the Safety Information Protection Task Force, with the inputs from the other expert groups, including the panel of experts responsible for Annex 19. And we'll present that to our Air Navigation Commission, which is the internal body, technical experts in ICAO, that advises our council as to whether these provisions should be ultimately adopted and go into our annexes, and then require states to comply. So I think I'll leave it there. I'll let maybe Ken will follow up more on the technical details of the language, but it's a very important week for us at ICAO. I hope to have more to report later this week. Thank you.
Well, again, and thank you for staying with us today and coming back for the OSA conference. So Ken, as we said, you were the co-chair of the Safety Information Protection, but you're also counsel to the Flight Safety Foundation, and you've got a lot of experience on both sides, both in the U.S. and internationally, on the potential risks to these programs. Could you elaborate a little bit more, both from your SIP task force work and your private practice?
Sure. And good morning, and thanks again to IFALPA for the invitation. And a big thanks to John Illson, who's been a critical Secretariat leader on the safety information protection for the last 3 years. The risks are quite easy to identify. It will shut down your program, basically. The world, to its great credit, with your leadership, Tony, and many others in this room, has done a wonderful job of gathering, identifying, sharing, analyzing, and now with MITRE and many others, putting an analysis and mitigation measures into place as a predictive matter to begin improving safety without the need for an accident and forensic analysis. Wonderful stuff, but I hate to tell you, there's absolutely little to no protection over these reams of data that you are collecting. Here in the States, you have a little bit more from a Freedom of Information Act perspective for SIS and FOQA and ASAP, and of course, individuals, entities can agree as they have here in the States and others, so that we can all agree that as between the National Civil Aviation Authority and the entity providing the information, that there will not be, on the one hand, retribution and discipline on the employee who comes forward, on the other from the regulator not to penalize the company or the individual to take suspension or revocation or civil penalty action. That's all well and good, and that's very nice protection. But you're leaving out two enormous players, namely prosecutors and plaintiffs, right? So in a civil and criminal context, all of this data, all of the voluntary reports can and increasingly are subject to requests to turn the data over to do what? Exactly what we said in Annex 13 and what we're now hoping very soon ICAO will be saying in the context of Annex 19, which is that safety information should only be used for safety-related purposes, not to establish liability. Well, guess what? It is being used to establish liability. If you look at the Rogers-Hoyle case recently out of the UK, even in the last year, I mean, in that context, a judge looked at this in the context of a tragedy, and the plaintiff said, we want to get in all aspects of an accident report, everything, not just technical findings, not just interviews, kit and caboodle, accident report. For what purpose? To establish liability. And the judge said, well, this is highly relevant. And everyone said, well, this is going to have a chilling effect from cooperating with accident authorities. He said, that's well and good, but I don't see any law that restricts me, so it comes in. Now, and that's over the objection of the airlines and people, the CAA, folks who are desperately trying to educate the judiciary that this is not a good thing, that we're carefully constructing this mountains of data to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. If you look at what happened in the Calm Air decision, right? You have a magistrate who's being asked to turn over ASAP FOQA type reports. And again, A4A comes in, the airline comes in, ALPA comes in. Your Honor, don't do this. It will have a chilling effect. It's very powerful information. The magistrate looks at it and says, well, that's great. That's a policy argument. I'm not a policy person. I'm a judge. What law do you have? Well, self-analysis, critical self-analysis privilege. Okay, like a psychiatrist? That doesn't apply? That's never really seen that. Nice try. Do you have any other law? The judge says, what about Congress? They saw fit to really protect the CVR via statute, so it seems I can't willy-nilly admit an actual recording into trial. Have they acted? Well, no. Okay, comes in. So occurrence reports, accident reports are being made available by plaintiffs, by prosecutors, accepted by the judiciary as we speak, which is why I've, with the great support, and our new CEO, John Beatty, is here, the Flight Safety Foundation has put this on an urgent priority list, and why I dedicated all the pro bono time to serving on the task force and trying to lead it in the direction of providing additional safeguards. The international standards, in my view, are subjective, ambiguous, weak, ineffectual, otherwise lousy. Not to put too fine of a point on it, not a diplomatic way to say it. What does it say? Safety information should generally be used for safety-related purposes. What does it say about misuse in the judicial context? Well, unless it's deemed necessary for the appropriate administration of justice. That's the standard that exists today in the attachment E in Annex 13. So you're not, many of you are not lawyers, but I think you can pretty much figure out that an exception that says unless it's necessary for the appropriate administration of justice, not even saying who makes that determination, is something that any of you can drive a truck through. So what we've said, and what I'm very hopeful for the Air Navigation Commission meeting tomorrow, and it's a big meeting, and I've been spending a lot of time on this, including at a retreat with the ICAO Council over the last 3 days, and up late last night, communicating to the Air Navigation Commission from Chair Jonathan Alec and myself, a very important paper that we just sent in, urging them to take action now. There are some who want to delay and have this be further coordinated with other people and have other people tinker with it. We've said enough is enough. We have a specific mandate relating back to 2010 for a multidisciplinary task force. We brought in all the experts. We heard all these countries, all these experts. We came up with a very sensible list of recommendations to provide more specific language that would really tilt the balance in the context of civil litigation, FOIA requests, criminal prosecution. You need to make sure and understand how important this is, and it shall not be admitted. You should come up with something, states, to ensure it shall not be used for non-safety related purposes, unless you have a very high specific threshold, and then even then, we have said, if you do so, you need to have appropriate safeguards put into place. You need to have a protective order. You need to make sure it's not made public. You need to make sure it's perhaps reviewed under seal and in camera. Very specific things, including don't do this on the fly. All countries should have what the European Commission is now saying too, which are advance arrangements in place. So we're not fighting over these data battles in the terrible context of an accident, right? So it's an important body of work that I've been pleased to play a part of. It's taken 4 years, which I'm used to with ICAO, and John's more patient than I am, having been up there much longer. But in my view, the time for action is now. That time is tomorrow, and I'm very hopeful that the leadership of the Air Navigation Commission and some of you that have folks who might have other people participating in those deliberations are at long last going to embrace our recommendations. We're going to move this forward for comment to states and frankly for action for states. So if this comes up in the future, there will be clear international guidance and standards, binding standards, not just policy material, and then hopefully legislation that is going to put in place a framework that will allow you to continue to breathe life into predictive aviation safety information sharing systems. Good on you for having developed that, but we need to make sure that that mountain of data is not subject to abuse and misuse as it is today.
Thank you, Ken. I'd like to follow up on some of those questions after we go through the panel here. But David, as a Canadian airline, you've been subject to safety management for a number of years now. I think Canada was probably one of the premier states to implement SMS. So surely you face some of these questions that have come up. I mean, from your perspective, how has that affected your operation, and where do you see the greatest risks, both to the airline and to your employees?
Right. So, I think through the lens of an SMS carrier, if you like, so perhaps a little bit more of a micro view than some of the macro views we're talking about interstate. Unfortunately, if it were as easy as finding the people with the black hats and the white hats on in terms of misuse of data, then our jobs wouldn't be quite as challenging. But the volumes of data that even components of an SMS, let alone an entire SMS system, bring forward, becomes a little bit like drinking out a fire hose for an organization. And to sort of talk about our experience and how SMS has affected the journey of how we deal with the use of data. Really, organizations are full of people, as we talked about in the panel this morning, and there's values and behaviors that people have and expectations with regard to what you're going to use data for, the whole topic of punitive behavior and that sort of thing. So we've had something in our industry that we want to see change, and we talked about moving the needle when it came to just culture. So for us, SMS has been a tool to help move those behaviors and expectations. And by that I mean that, you know, there's a certain momentum in human beings and how they use things and their expectations of what they can do. What SMS has done for us, and I think the expectation, is it provides a framework that we can redefine how we're going to deal with new sets of data. So it's, you know, it's certainly policies and processes and tools, but it's really giving us the structure to define what is appropriate use and what isn't appropriate use. And you know, there's been a couple references already today about using things for safety versus other uses, and I think that that's a very valid topic, because when you have opportunities around data, you're going to start asking questions about additional uses aside from what I'll call the obvious safety uses. And again, SMS provides some of the framework for an organization to start drawing some boxes around questions like that. If we're going to use it in an expanded way, how do we do that? Again, talking about the white hats and the black hats, you know, our experience when we run into challenges about how people wanted to use information, whether that's safety reports or FOCA data, has not been people out there trying to do evil. It's been people trying to accomplish some objective with the data, but not really understanding what the implications could be for individuals in the system, what the implications could be for the entire reporting culture of the organization. And so SMS, again, gives people the education, the structure, the process to govern how that happens. And, you know, one of the things that was interesting about Jazz's journey is, unlike perhaps some of the carriers in the US, because of where SMS rulemaking is we had an SMS, not that you ever finished implementing SMS, but we had SMS in place before we implemented our FOCA program and before we started implementing our fatigue risk management program, and these things have come up already. And what our experience was is that we worked out the rules of the road, so to speak, through SMS about how you deal with voluntary information, whether it be pilots or maintenance professionals, anyone in the organization, how you deal with information that's been brought to you in that context for the entire system. And so when we looked at our FOCA program and when we looked at our fatigue risk management program, we had already written the rules as part of the framework of SMS, and we essentially didn't have to reinvent the principles around appropriate use, for example. And as a result, while we certainly had to work on a few details, implementing our flight data monitoring analysis program was almost a non-event from the perspective of concerns that the front line would have about what we were going to do with the data, because they'd already built a level of confidence in the process and the procedures around how we processed safety reports, for example. And the trust was there that there was a governance in place that was transparent through SMS, so that when we came along with a new application or a new source of data, in this case, I'll use FOCA as an example, we didn't have to rediscover, you know, what it meant to use information appropriately. Something like a FOCA program is even more important to have confidence in, because it doesn't have the same direct voluntary nature to it that a safety report does, obviously. But we found that, again, we had to pen some additional details around the governance, but the rules were already there, and the confidence was there, and the trust was there. And similarly for the fatigue risk management program, in our world, we don't talk about fatigue reports any differently than we talk about any other safety-related report. We don't think we need that noise and complication in the system. We collect some different data associated with fatigue, but we've used the framework that SMS provided. You know, and in terms of how has that worked from a trust perspective, again, this is an SMS journey for us. We saw an explosion in the rates of reporting in all groups. Pilot reporting was always sort of part of the culture there, but even in that group, great increases. Maintenance, even our airport services groups, our dispatch groups, and that sort of thing. So we've, a little bit of the proof in the pudding whether or not there's trust there is often whether or not you're getting the reporting. The other thing that we saw is that the nature of the reports changed over time. So we see much more often now a report about an error of some sort that was made that's not necessarily high profile or high risk, but people have gotten the message about data being what we're after. We're not just after the high profile stuff, because frankly, we kind of knew about the high-profile stuff before. You don't need an SMS program for that. So we had people putting in reports where they clearly understand and buy into the concept that I'm putting this in because it's a point of data that's creating an aggregate view of what's going on in the organization. And not just waiting for the big events to happen or something that's of a personal value to them. They're giving us, if I can call it, the little stuff that's helping us to create larger pictures about what's going on in the organization. So, the nature of the reporting, the rates of the reporting, I think are important indicators that this framework that SMS has provided has had some success. But the other measure, I guess, is looking at how, I think I'm the first management airline guy today on a panel here, but see how the management side has changed the way it responds to information and data, including reports. There is a guttural need people have to respond to things, and when you have de-identified information, in a way you take some of the options away from people, which is important at the beginning of a culture change. But we've seen, even in cases where the organization could have taken a disciplinary approach because of exclusions in our policy, that they've sat back and said, is that actually the right thing to do, and have chosen in a couple high-profile cases not to go down that road because they actually start living the just culture principles and what we want to get out of the reporting, rather than just sort of depending on policy to do something just because you can do it from a disciplinary point of view. So, those sorts of experiences and observing that is also indicating that the culture of the management group is changing as well. So, in terms of use, misuse, obviously policy, process will help govern that, but it will also build the trust, and through transparency of the process, every individual on the front line doesn't need to track every single piece of data going through the system if they truly believe that the process has been built in a way that they can have confidence in. And again, SMS kind of provides that holistic approach. Doesn't matter if it's fatigue, what safety issue it is, it provides that approach to provide confidence for your employees. And I think we've started to see that for sure.
Great, thank you. So Juan Carlos, you fly for an airline based in a country that practices civil law. I'm not an attorney, but civil law being a bit different than common law in the United States and in North America. Tell us about your concerns, both as a pilot and someone who has practiced in this environment.
Thank you, Tony. First of all, I would like to thank my brothers from IFALPA International for inviting me here. Thank you, Tony. Yes, I'm one of the few non-American person here in this forum, and I have the privilege of having been involved in international work for a long time. In my country, as well as in other countries in the world, for example, the introduction of the Annex 19, the development of the Annex 19 of ICAO has been a major change, and for the good. Overall speaking, now there is an increased attention to information, safety data. So this is the good point. But there is another not so good point, is that many people is confusing authorities, organizations all over the world, including probably some of the European countries. They are confusing the tool with the objective, with the aim. I mean, safety information is a tool. It's not an objective. So it's a tool that gives us the possibility to manage safety. Probably because there is some lack of safety promotion activities or safety training activities all over the world. Now we have Annex 19, which for me is like a high-definition TV, brand new high-definition TV. We have a distance command, but we don't know how to which button to push. So it's a complex thing that needs a lot of work. So I will give you a couple of examples of what I'm saying. There are some countries, for example, that they're trying to go too far with the collection of safety information. For example, in my country, in Spain, the differentiation between mandatory reporting and voluntary reporting is so blurred, it's inexistent. Everything needs to be reported. Okay, that's fine. Maybe the objective of that, it's fine. But how can you do that in a country that has no cultural background on reporting? The aviation professionals in my country, in the Southern Europe countries, but I can go to Asia, for example. It's not the same background that you can have here, for example, in the US. So it's difficult to implement a measure like this, trying to go too far. I will also give another example, and Ken has been very clear talking about accident investigation and the safety information involved in accident investigation. And certainly, this is probably the most evident case of misuse of safety information. But we have also misuse, we have detected some misuse of safety information, for example, with the flight data monitoring, flight data analysis programs. We know that there are airlines that they are applying a very strong punitive policy, for example, with unstabilized approaches. All those unstabilized approaches that do not end in a go-around will be punished. I mean, the people, the pilots will be punished. So we don't need to go too far to an accident, but we have some day-to-day cases where the safety information can be misused. And this is a huge risk, in my opinion, because forcing the pilots, forcing the front-end users, as we normally say in Europe, to report does not necessarily improve safety. Reporting, again, is a tool. So what we need to reflect is the pilot or the maintenance technician or the controller or the handling people, sorry, they need to perceive that the information is useful. They need to perceive that there is going to be a change with the information they provide. That means, and I agree totally with David, that safety management requires a huge cultural change in the organizations and in the authorities too. So the US model, for example, this morning we have seen that it's a model that it's used, or at least is recognized in many parts of the world as a good model with some historical background, building step by step. So this is probably the model to follow. Mr. Shahidi from MITRE mentioned about the APAC region, the Asia Pacific region is a focal point. And maybe the countries in this area are not ready to embrace these safety information sharing initiatives, because not only about cultural things, but the legal systems are not prepared for that. So we need to be aware of that. And finally, I would like to give you a couple of examples from my region, which is probably the region I know the most in Europe. We have had recent developments focusing on just culture. We have a regulation on accident investigation, Regulation 996/2010. In the preamble of this regulation, just culture is specifically mentioned. And there are, in the Article 14, there is a specific article using the word shall about protection of sensitive safety information. But of course, as John mentioned, the sovereignty of the states is there. So everything that these shall not be used for purposes other than safety always has a except in the cases that the national laws or the competent authority values the disclosure of this information. We have and in the case of accident investigation, especially in the southern part of Europe, we are always looking for sinners. We are looking always something to blame. So there are huge differences even in Europe about the perception of this. And there is a very, very recent regulation, 374, it has been published this year about occurrence reporting, Again, the just culture is mentioned in the preamble, but the new thing on this regulation is that just culture has a definition. It is in the legislation. And it is also in some articles that what we are looking with this is we are promoting just culture. We have been, IFALPA has been present in the development of these two regulations through our European branch, which is European Cockpit Association. And just to summarize, it is essential to this collaborative effort like you are doing here in the US. We need to replicate this in other regions in the world in order to be successful with this thing.
Great. Thank you all. So each of you raised points that I'd like to address, but before we do, I'm going to ask the big question. Let's assume these are not aviation folks, general public. Why does aviation get treated differently than any other sector? We have a representative from the medical community here. We have, I think, pharmaceuticals next door meeting. Why do we need protections in aviation versus in highways or transit, other forms of transit, pharmaceuticals, other sectors of our society? Can we make that compelling argument that we're different, or are we different?
Maybe
Monkoff?
my answer to that question is that maybe the model we have been using in the past to improve safety is exhausted. I mean, we cannot continue using this model. We need a different model. And one of the requisites for that is to protect the reporters.
And I'd say that they're not, depends on the context. In the criminal application, we're not saying we're any different. We are saying that to the extent that you believe that there is evidence of gross negligence, willful misconduct, go ahead and bring your criminal case. At the same time, aviation has catastrophic consequences when it fails, and it puts enormous amount of pressure on prosecutors. And I have direct evidence, in fact, very recently from Munich, of a plaintiff's lawyer, very prominent one, telling me point blank, and I asked him publicly, of taking as much as they can, being as obnoxious of the requests that they can, to embarrass the company, to ask for everything in the hopes that they can get a judge to reveal it, and then somehow the price of poker just went up, and they settled the case for a lot more because it would have been publicly revealed and embarrassing the company. And then they also take that and they go to the prosecutor and they say, you should really bring a criminal case. So we're saying apply criminal law in a normal context, but don't define every tragedy as gross negligence where you, by definition, always open a criminal action because safety is at risk. People will clam up. There is a chilling effect, not unlike the medical profession that began just culture. So we're not asking for exceptions, but we are asking for greater data protection, particularly as it applies in the civil context. We're also asking, too, though, that the laws be enforced. We need to have law in the books, and they be enforced. In Spain, as an example, there was a law in force in 996, 2010, says basically, thou shalt not be reviewing a cockpit voice recorder. And in Spanair, they played it on national television. Now, what kind of enforcement is taking place over this fairly egregious violation of the law? So get laws in place to provide further protection, and then you have to have the will to enforce the law.
David?
I don't think that fundamentally there is a difference with aviation. We're made up of people doing things, people who come to work to do a good job that are human beings, so they're fallible. They're part of systems that themselves are fallible. And I think actually our industry, if there's a difference, we can show through data that it works to get at an understanding of what's going wrong perhaps in the system. Whereas in some other industries, and I'm certainly no expert from the medical profession, but I'm sure that there's lots of data out there to show that where we have systems that you do not have the ability to get at that information directly from people, that there's a consequence to it. And again, to your point, we're at such a high level of safety in aviation. I mean, there's nowhere else for us to go but to use the data. But that doesn't mean that principle doesn't apply to any human endeavor, I don't think. So we're at a different place legally, we're at a different place in the journey and what we're doing with it. So there's huge differences there, but fundamentally I think it's the same lesson that any area of human endeavor can learn from.
That was the answer I was hoping for. So if I hear you correctly, if other sectors were to develop these types of programs, we would encourage the legislature, the judicial systems to basically do what you're asking, which is provide these protections.
Absolutely.
Good. I'm glad we got consensus on that. On the international side, so not being an attorney, how does an ICAO recommendation or standard impact legal systems that look for culpability, that look for someone to be at fault? Is there a direct correlation? Can the international standards influence the judicial systems in these countries?
John might know better, but yes. The answer is yes. If you look at the Montreal Convention, we have very clearly now international standards, ratified treaties that become binding norms that provide for basically waiver of liability and compensation to the victims that have radically transformed how we treat loved ones in the wake of a tragedy. They can have a very profound positive step. What we found in the task force, though, is that when we do have a civil common law jurisdictions, there are varying degrees of separation from judiciary. So what we found was, okay, first we need the standard in place. Thou shall implement systems to protect to a greater extent safety information, and let us tell you how. But even where we cannot enact positive law that might handcuff a prosecutor or a judge from misusing it in a court of law, we've talked about a working group that will go forth and hopefully with the support of ALPA and IFALPA and IATA and others to educate the judiciary, to educate prosecutors and others on the importance of this. And we've already seen benefits. We've seen benefits in Brazil, which has a very good training program in place where they've made decisions to not turn over voluntary occurrence reports because they had gone through the training. We've seen that with the Just Culture Task Force in Europe. So there are things absent binding law, but binding law holds a very important place. Judges, in the absence of any law, international or national, are much more likely to let these information requests in because it sounds in the abstract highly relevant. I have an accident, the allegation is negligence, and you have what? You have a report of safety occurrences with 1,576. I'm going to let this plaintiff look at that and to see if he can tie a connection between what you knew or should have known and what happened here. And let me tell you, that's my cross-examination material. I'd go through that if I were a plaintiff lawyer, which I never am. I'm always defending. But that's a powerful thing. Let me give you this one. Directing your attention, sir. You learned on this date. Did you know about it? What did you do about it? Again, price of poker goes up when that's made available.
So the administrator this morning talked about risk-based decision-making. And clearly, in the airline industry, you have to make decisions based on hazards and risks all the time. So you're sitting on a lot of data, and you're going to accept certain risks. What if you have that incident, that accident, God forbid, and do you find yourself exposed? Has there been a case in Canada where that has happened, where you have a robust SMS system, you did all the right things? Is there a case? Is there any case law in Canada where that may have come up?
I don't know about a case law, but I know that it's been a topic of conversation. In fact, one of the things I think that is a risk, sort of a bit of a different risk when you have this level of data, is making the assumption you're going to find out about anything that's embedded in that data. And when things do happen, it's always easier to go back and look at your data from the perspective of what happened and reverse engineer and say, there it was right there, you should have known.
Right.
However, one of the things that we find, I know we're not alone, is that when you have this level of data, it's a huge field of data, and the vast majority of what you're looking at, in some cases, all of what you're looking at, is moderate to low risk indicators. But it's massive. So you're looking for patterns, you're looking for anything that could suggest a precursor. And in that context, when you don't know the future, the one that's going to connect the dots and turn into something as unlikely it is, the question, I think, and I'm not a lawyer, becomes, if something does happen, where was your due diligence? Were you, within reason, availing yourself of the data? Were you looking for the patterns? Were you giving sort of the focus and attention that you could in the context of the time when you have this huge field of data? Not after the fact, when again you can reverse engineer and find some little nugget somewhere that relates to the issue. So I know that's on the minds of airlines when they're looking at data. Are we doing a good enough job? But I'm not aware of case law where that's come up and sort of bit people after the fact.
So it is, and there is a case, and there's a flight attendant who had experienced the aircraft experienced a tail strike, and she freaked out, and she didn't want to continue flying, and so eventually the company got rid of her, and she challenged it under Health and Safety Act law in Canada, and of course her lawyer wanted all of the occurrence reports of Air Canada, and again, trying to piece it together. And Air Canada and the association went in and said, no, chilling effect. This was derived for a different purpose. Judge said, Health and Safety Act versus what do you have as law to protect this? Nothing, turn it all over. So we do have a case in Canada. Canada is an extremely important place. It's the first jurisdiction I would want national legislation passed to protect all forms of accident and incident information, because a lot of the data sharing information agreements are between ICAO, IATA, ACI, all of whom are up there.
Interesting. Good, thank you. Why don't we take a quick break? Anybody from the audience? Do we have one text in?
Yes. We have a couple of text messages. Mr. Quinn, you talked about the protections for like ASAP and FOQA reports. This question is kind of on that same thread. Is the traditional NASA ASRS report subject to that same caveat unless necessary for the administration of justice? Or are there different or deeper protections in place versus ASAP or FOQA type data?
That's kind of a U.S.-based question. So under U.S. new law, under Last Reauthorization Act, they would generally have protection in response to a Freedom of Information Act request. So over things like that for the NASA-type reports and the ESIAS and ASAP and FOQA that only exist within U.S. law when you go over the border. That does not exist. It doesn't exist in Europe either. And none of it exists with respect to civil litigation or criminal prosecution. There's no protection over that data in those contexts. The industry attempted to get language in the last reauthorization bill that it would not be admissible, any of this information would be admissible in any context. They swung for the fence, they got the House to approve it, it was a huge mistake, plaintiffs' lawyers woke up, killed the whole bill. So we need to have a more nuanced balancing test, which is the model that we put into place in a recommendation that will be considered tomorrow by the ANC.
And an additional question, this is for David. What changes has JAS seen with its reporting and use of the data since implementing SMS? And the follow-up question to that was, are there any lessons learned that can be shared, things that you've done differently, better, that you can share with the group as other nations are ready to implement SMS?
Well, in terms of some lessons learned, I mentioned the term drinking from a fire hose earlier. I don't think up front we did a very good job at predicting the positive response to the reporting message. And as a result of that, managing expectations became a bit of a challenge. So there's obviously a big difference between the concept of every single individual report is treated as the same sort of risk-based response versus looking at all your reports as points of data that's trying to draw a picture from a trend perspective. So we did experience a little bit of frustration with more than the pilot group, with other groups, people expecting that there'd be a marching band created for every single report, you know, and we, even at our airline, depending on the month, we get between 400 and 600 safety reports from different groups, and we have to take a risk-based approach, and that means using data. So one learning was we really should have, I guess, explained that a little bit better up front. And the other one is less to the line employees, but from a management point of view, one of the things that we still have to be careful of is segregating the use between safety investigation and other reasons to use data. And this, you know, gets to the appropriate use argument. So, for example, at our organization, within the SMS context and our policies, if my department, for example, does a safety investigation, we have a very specific objective there. It's safety. And if we happen to run into anything along the way that becomes something that would be of interest from an HR perspective or a discipline perspective, or there could be a number of other things, we stop there. And, you know, we've gotten questions from, say, the Human Resource Department about, well, you know, can we use that information? Can we use the safety investigation file? Which, of course, we don't. There was a question earlier in the morning about segregating the safety investigation versus the HR investigation, that sort of thing. So SMS, one of the things that's changed is there are some very hard lines that we've drawn in the sand with regard to use, and the investigation for safety versus other purposes is one of them. So essentially, you know, we could have put a lot of effort into an investigation, and there may be some valuable information there for other purposes, and it may not be disciplinary. It could be irregularity issues or technical issues, but we, as a rule, just don't provide that information over those walls because it's too slippery a slope. One day it may seem appropriate, it's kind of gray, you know, nobody's going to get hurt here, but we just can't take that chance. So the way we treat investigations has changed quite a bit through SMS. But again, it's the volume is what really changed for us from a reporting perspective. It's generally been a good thing though, but managing it has been a challenge.
No questions from the field? We have one here.
Hi, sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice, so if you don't hear me speak, I'll try to speak up. But my name is Kristen Brown. I'm a pilot for Air Wisconsin Airlines, and this question is for everyone on the panel, including Tony, if you don't mind, since you are part of the FAA safety branch. But in the context of the discussion we had earlier, and in this discussion before getting to the civil litigation side, everyone talks about the U.S. system and how we have a model of a system. However, there have been some failures in that, and my question is kind of, how do we address the inconsistencies in voluntary safety programs that have they have standards, however, sometimes programs are approved that don't actually meet those standards. So how do we fix that problem with it being a voluntary safety program like FOQA, for example, where the ultimate stakeholder, the pilot, may or may not have the ability to control that data and how it gets used if a program is approved without any sort of pilot involvement, which has happened here in the past, excuse me. And kind of as a follow-up to that, how do you kind of try to, or is there the ability to prevent some of those programs from taking place if just culture is not quite understood at the management level at those airlines? Let me know if you have questions about that.
Anyone want to take that on?
I can just, talking about the FOQA program, there is one initiative in Europe. You know, we the Europeans, we are very clever, and we change the names to everything, you know. So in Europe there's no FOQA, it's not even called flight data analysis, it's called flight data monitoring. But EASA, which is the European Agency for Aviation Safety, has developed a working group, is more a forum with airlines and pilot representatives and workers, but basically with pilots. And what EASA is doing is promoting the EASA, the authority, is sending the message that there is a need for an agreement between pilots and airlines on how to use flight data. Because what the authority is saying is that we are not being efficient on the use of flight data, and that is because there are constraints, because these data cannot be used under certain circumstances. And what the authority is doing is creating some kind of trust between the pilot's body and the airline, and say, hey guys, you have to sit down and talk and agree a minimum, at least a minimum, on how to handle this kind of flight data. I think it's a good approach.
John, you have a comment?
Thanks, Tony. I just wanted to comment that in the ICAO annexes, we have requirements for state-level reporting, such as the ASRS program here in the United States, and also for the flight data analysis or FOCA programs at the service provider level. We don't have a specific requirement for voluntary reporting yet within the airlines internationally, although it's quite prevalent here, but we'd like to have one. But going back to David's comment, I think one of his first comments in his opening remarks was they had an SMS framework in place, and then they started applying the different types of reporting systems or information collection systems, data collection systems. Once that framework was established and well known, that trust was built, and as a result, they have significant amounts of data that is at their disposal now. So we're taking the same approach at ICAO. We want to be sure that these provisions are in place that protect the information appropriately and be sure that it's not misused. And then we can look forward and see what types of new forms of data should we be requiring states or airlines to collect and incorporate into their analysis programs. One of the, I think, key recommendations that came out of the Safety Information Protection Task Force in recognition of the importance to protect the information that's collected and used by the airlines or other service providers was the inclusion of a new provision specifically addressing and providing protection to the data that's voluntarily submitted to an airline or another service provider, and the analysis reports and other types of reports that are generated by that data, so that that also does not fall victim to misuse. And I don't know, Ken, if you want to comment on that, but it's a very specific provision that would be included in this package that's going to the Commission tomorrow.
Yeah, it's just not the occurrence itself. It's really everything that you do with that. So protect all of that safety-related information. And that's what I get. We have a very large aviation practice, and every single week I'm asked by one of my clients, hey, I found out about this. What should I do about it? And all too often, unfortunately, it depends on how's your relationship with your inspector. Do they get it? Is it a gotcha game, or is it a just culture environment? If it's a gotcha game and you've delayed, or maybe they heard about it, then you know what, just go fix it. If it's one where you've had it for a few weeks, but you've proactively been investigating it and implementing it, and you have a strong relationship and they really understand just culture, then they should embrace this, even though technically they might be able to play gotcha. So there's the on-high international standards that John deals with, and then the shop floor that I get to deal with too. And it's interesting how the twain sometimes never meet, both within the FAA organization itself, as well as sometimes, unfortunately, my own clients.
David? Yeah.
I just, one of the questions is about a management group, let's say, that's not as enlightened as you might prefer. I think it's important that the focus isn't just on line employees when it comes to terms like expectations, consequences, education, and transparency. And, you know, in our case, for example, we look at certain indicators which will tell us whether or not a particular management group has embraced the way you respond, for example, to safety reports or to data. You know, we look at things like the reporting rates by specific group, which can tell you whether or not the culture within that group from a management perspective is kind of getting it. We also, you know, we look at, you know, targets around things like that. It may seem like a little bit of a dirty trick, but sometimes, you know, you put information like that out, which is quite revealing, and you get a little bit of more of an incentive, I guess, from a management perspective to address if there are any pockets where, you know, sort of the culture is not really catching on to a behavior that's appropriate in the system. So, and there also have to be consequences. So people are going to mess up. And, despite what some people think, managers and supervisors are people too. They're also human, and they're gonna mess up. And sometimes that messing up means that they use something inappropriately or react inappropriately. But there has to be consequences, which sounds punitive, ironically. But what I mean by that is it could be anything from coaching, training, education, to in some cases having to take a much harder line when somebody in management just is in the wrong frame of mind, the way they deal with things. So I just want to offer that comment. It's not just about what we tell frontline employees that they're expected to do, it's about what we tell the management team as well.
Well, I don't want to dodge your question, but I think it's really one for John Duncan. But I will say this, that the most successful programs are those programs where you have that relationship between all three parties. We can see that from the data coming in and from the success of the mitigations once they're put in place. So I don't know if that helps. We have a text message.
Yeah, we have two text questions. The first one I think is for John and Ken. We've talked a lot about the Air Navigation Commission's meeting tomorrow. This text question says, what specifically are the Air Navigation Commission's options tomorrow?
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, the Air Navigation Commission will decide on, first of all, whether or not to accept the proposals that I work in the Secretariat. We're the civil servants that bring in groups of experts, such as the Information Protection Task Force, Safety Management Panel, et cetera, and they develop the recommendations that we then carry forward to the Air Navigation Commission for its consideration. The Air Navigation Commission is comprised of 19 international experts. They don't represent their states, they represent their expertise of their respective domains. And their options tomorrow are to accept the proposals. There may be some amendments through the discussions in the meeting tomorrow. We wouldn't think they would be substantive at this time. There's been a lot of vetting of these proposals over the last year or so. And once they accept them, then the next step would be for yet another round of consultation, this time with our member states and the industry organizations such as IATA, IFALPA, and others. That takes about 90 days. So we would issue what we call a state letter. It's a letter that goes out to all of our member states and the international organizations with whom we collaborate regularly and recognize. They would then see the complete package that has been approved by the Air Navigation Commission, and all of those stakeholders would have the opportunity to provide their comment. After that, we would finish the consultation phase around the end of September, I believe, and we would then go back to the Air Navigation Commission in November and present to them every comment that we have received, and the Secretariat's consideration of those comments and whether or not they would lead to additional amendments to the proposals that we're going to discuss tomorrow. Subsequent to that, we will come through with a final set of recommendations that the Air Navigation Commission would then present to the ICAO Council. The ICAO Council is our governing body, and they would then decide whether or not to adopt these proposals. If the decision is in fact to adopt the proposals, then these new provisions would go into the ICAO annexes, primarily Annex 19, although we have a few related amendments to Annex 6 in flight operations, and also Annex 13, accident and incident investigation. And once they're adopted, states would then have normally 6 to 8 months to comply, but I think in this case, and I'll ask Ken if he wants to follow up, these are very complex recommendations that impact not only the regulatory authority, but also the state judicial systems. And so our recommendation from the Secretariat side in working with the Information Protection Task Force is to allow states a significantly longer time to comply to ensure that the implementation is sound. And right now we're looking at potentially an 18-month period from the time the Council adopts until these new standards would become mandatory. So it's a fairly intricate process. Maybe it provides some insight as to why it takes ICAO so long sometimes to get things through our system, but it has to be collaborative, it has to be consensus-based, otherwise we don't see the implementation rate that we'd like to see in the future. Ken?
Can you give me?
Takes a long time. But it is consensus-based organization. The nice thing will be the other option is they could delay it further. They could kick it more to the safety management panel. There could be more attempts to tinker with the language. In my view, it could expose it to weakening the strength of the recommendations and not getting this information into the hands of states. The nice thing is if you, because of the nature of our recommendations, go to organic law and different judicial systems, getting our entire package to states in the form of what they call a state letter begins the process not just to reply and do everything that John said, and hopefully it'll be a subject of the high-level safety conference early next year, but they're moving forward. The European Commission has moved forward, I think, quite smartly. A number of our colleagues in Latin America, I think, have moved quite smartly already. So this will help inform them about what the international standards are going to be and what you should be doing. So while they can wait for all of this to be enacted and the implementation date for the binding standards to occur, which could be a long period of time, it gives them the tools and the actual language necessary to make positive change now. So before the international standard kicks into an effective implementation date. And I'm hopeful it'll help things here in the States and actually around the world. And we're prepared to move forward in light of this, working with industry to draw attention to the new international standards and make changes in positive law to protect that which you're all collecting and analyzing right now.
A question from the floor?
I just wanted to explore a couple of the issues of intercompany or intra-company dynamics that David touched on earlier. So kind of a double-barrel question. The first instance, when you were building the data usage procedures and policies, was the HR department a willing participant in that? Did they see the value in building the brick wall in terms of data usage, or was upper management involvement required to, I don't know if keep them in line is the right phrase, but you get what I'm saying. The second question would be, you also mentioned the different reporting rates amongst different groups within the company. Just interested in your opinion, did you require very different approaches to building the reporting culture amongst those different groups, or did everyone kind of respond to similar motivators at the end of the day?
Sure. Okay, just on the first question, just being quite honest, we involved everyone when we were developing the policies and the governance and the process, but I think some folks perhaps weren't paying as close attention while we were doing that. So it was something that was I think understood when it was tested. So we did have, for example, HR groups did not object to anything because, to a certain degree, some of what you see in SMS is a little bit motherhood. It's kind of apple pie at a certain level, right? So who's going to stand up and say, yeah, just culture's bad, or that sort of thing? But then when they kick into gear and try and sort of repeat an old pattern, that's when they find out what that really means when the rubber hits the road. So we do still find that there's some folks who have a bit of difficulty with some of the lines that we've drawn, for example, with the investigation example. At the end of the day, it doesn't go very high in the organization because we've built a strong enough foundation there that certain things just have to be sacred to protect the process and future reporting. So it was a bit of both. There wasn't objections from groups like HR, but I think perhaps because they weren't necessarily envisioning what it would mean and what it would have to change for their groups. And it means more work as well. They saw potentially a safety investigation process as saving them some work, right? It doesn't work that way. So that was on that point. The reporting rates was actually one of the lessons learned that I didn't mention before. When we first started promoting reporting more and why we're doing it, we had one message to the entire audience. And to my surprise, one of the bits of feedback I got a couple times from the pilot group was being a little bit offended. And the offense was that, why do you think you have to tell us about the importance of reporting? We already have that culture. So we pretty quickly realized we need to regroup a little bit here, and they're very different audiences. A maintenance community versus a pilot community, different traditions when it came to reporting, and different experiences when it came to, if I could say, at least the perceived punitive nature to, in terms of management reacting. So within maintenance, there was a different dynamic going on there, and we had to work very, very closely and differently with both the maintenance frontline group and the internal maintenance quality groups and that sort of thing. So I guess to answer your question, we ended up needing to customize very specifically to the different operational areas, and that was one of the early mistakes. There wasn't a big cost to it. We just annoyed a few folks at the outset, but that certainly would be advice for those who are still working on things like the reporting culture, to pay close attention to the different subcultures within the organization. It's a different message altogether.
So we heard a little bit this morning about coziness in the industry. And let me just kind of frame this. So in order for these data sharing programs to work, you need partnership collaboration between the regulators and the submitters of the information, whether they be the airlines or the associations. Not only in analyzing the data, but then putting in place the mitigations. How do we sell that to the public, right? Because when there is an incident, the finger pointing starts. And that's where the, quote, coziness comes in. How do we avoid that? How do we educate the public that this is the way you have to do it? To get where we talked about this morning with John Duncan, to change that culture of punitive versus collaborative or just culture. How do we educate the community on that, or the public, I should say?
Two quick points, I would say. One is, when I was in government at FAA and DOT, the most impressive organization I worked with was in the context of Lockerbie, and it was the CIA. And they can't tell you their success stories. You can. And frankly, I don't think you do a good enough job. You, the collective you, right? With industry in saying, because we identified this predictive problem, we were able to implement this mitigating measure and have seen an improvement in the margin of safety. And so I think that's a first very good point. The other one is one that we struggled with mightily on the task force, one of the most difficult issues, which is to say that while all of this is set up to protect the free flow of information and learn from mistakes, basically, the regulator does reserve unto itself, and must, the ability to bring appropriate enforcement action or take steps necessary to ensure safety. It's not so together that it's a get out of jail free or free pass. If it does really call into question the ability of, let's say, the airman to safely exercise his or her responsibilities, then you really do have to reserve in the egregious case an ability to make sure that there's a requalification, or an ability to make sure that we frankly just don't have people who are irresponsible or unfit or unqualified for whatever reason making those critical life decisions in the cockpit.
Juan Carlos, yeah, I was thinking more in Europe. I mean, do you see this opportunity? Is that happening where you're getting cooperation now with the regulators and the airlines?
Yeah, we are collaborating more and more. But I would like to point out that we tend to exclude the public in the discussions about safety. It's like a taboo. We don't want to talk to the public about safety because we perceive that this is our secret. And I have had the opportunity, Ken mentioned very briefly about the Spanair accident in Madrid. It was a tragedy. And I have had the opportunity to talk to the victims, the families of the victims. And I was really surprised how easy it was. I'm not talking about their potential interests in a civil litigation, but I was surprised how easy it was to explain to them that we don't want this to be repeated. They catch it immediately. They say, yes, you're right. And when they say, okay, what should we do? We say, okay, and we went on this path of we need more information, but this information, we need some requisites of non-punitive culture. And they understood it immediately. So I think that we need, it's the time to open the windows and send a message outside, send a structured message, agreed, all the community, all the aviation community, we need to agree some messages to talk to the public and be very open to them and say, you know, the previous model is not valid anymore, we need a new model, and I am sure that the public is not stupid. I mean, they will understand if we send the right message.
So you've given me the opportunity to ask a question that I was reluctant to ask, but I will. So one of the things we're grappling with, we have not had a passenger carrying accident in the United States in 5.5 years, knock on wood. But yet we identify hazards and risks every day, right? Both in our ongoing oversight of the airlines and in the SIAS. And yet, how do we convey that these are risks that have always been there? Now, we're addressing those before they manifest themselves into an accident. It's a very difficult message to get out. And, you know, I would hope forums like this can help us do that. But I find, speaking on behalf of the FAA, we're reluctant sometimes to do that because that exposes a risk out there and the public's going to be aware of it. Any thoughts on this? David, you must be facing that, or what?
It's a change. And every time we see a change, we are outside of our comfortable zone. We are very comfortable here talking about this because nobody's challenging us. I think we need to think about that and say, okay, if we are going outside, we will be challenged, for sure. But if we have a good message, I think we have nothing to fear. And if we have an open discussion, okay, go ahead. Probably somebody will kick our, but we need to accept that.
And just be data-driven, right? I mean, a SIAS, for example, is a data-driven process. You data drive that you have a problem, you implement a mitigation measure, you data drive the result that looks good, tell that story.
Easier said than done, but.
Of course. I was just going to, along the lines of telling the story, I think occasionally and unfortunately we have opportunities to tell the story, and that's often to counter the story that's out there. And I know in Canada's case, even SMS itself has not been without controversy, for example. And you hear terms like self-regulation, get out of jail free cards, all this stuff, which people who are knowledgeable understand that that's not really the case. So and it hits the media, it hits the political realm, including recently. And so I think we have to make sure that when we have those opportunities to counter the story, that I know it's a long road. We have to keep doing that. It doesn't, one opportunity doesn't do it, but we have to keep telling the story. And you mentioned a great point. Even something like SMS doesn't mean the system will tolerate absolutely anything from a risk perspective in the name of data collection. Of course it doesn't. It's a risk management system. There are limits. And that includes in the very, very rare case, but it includes when there's an individual in our system that's chosen the wrong vocation, if I can put it that way. But people will easily believe these quickie little self-regulation, get a jail-free card kind of taglines, unless we as an industry collectively are doing a good job at grabbing every single opportunity we can, and consistently. And that includes the regulator, and I know that I can't speak for government bodies, but you're in a more difficult situation to defend some of these systems, but I think collaboratively, again, we can do that together and just keep telling the story.
John, did you have a comment?
Thanks, Tony. Just very briefly, from ICAO's perspective, we had in place requirements for safety management systems for the airlines and other organizations prior to what we call the State Safety Program, which is essentially a safety management framework for the states. And within the SMS requirements for the airlines is a safety promotion pillar, if you will, of the SMS framework. And I think it's fair to say that those who have implemented SMS and done so successfully, in part have done so because they've been able to promote and socialize these concepts to their employees and the people who are in a position to report. We're looking forward to receiving recommendations from the Safety Management Panel on new requirements at the state level to promote safety in that context as well. I don't know what they'll look like yet, but I think that we're hoping, well, we are hoping that they will have that same type of impact, so that there's some education as to the benefits and the reasons that, yes, it's not a get out of jail free card, it won't prevent every accident, it's not a silver bullet. It is, however, the right thing to do. And so from our perspective, anything we can do, with all due respect to my friend Ken, it might take us a few years to get them on the books. That's the way the process works. But it's how we need to move in the right direction. And as we go through that process and as we consume all that time to do so, the more states and stakeholders that we bring along and educate and co-opt, and they become part of that process, the better it will be.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. I hope we can spread that message out very far and wide. Question from the floor.
Thanks, Tony. Alan Roy from the Southwest Airlines Pilots Association. I'll start out probably by asking just a rhetorical and kind of a funny question. Will the data protection suggestions from ICAO beat the FAA SMS rule? But that being said, Tony, I think one of the things, just to tag along with what y'all just talked about in that subject, is that when we continue to have these high-profile events, we collectively, as the regulator and our oversight in Congress, don't send the right message, because they're the ones that continue to, let's say when we have a wrong airport landing, they don't allow the investigation to take place. And then the real enemy is this demand in public, from the public, for perfection. I mean, our real message is, the administrator said it this morning, we have a huge amount of flights every year that are successfully completed, and we need to continue to do that. Do you want to tag along with, maybe give us an idea when the SMS is going to come along? The year 20...
Let's just say it's very close. I think if you went to the OMB website, you would see that they are reviewing it right now.
Thank you.
I've been told we're down to our last few minutes. Is there any last questions from the floor? If not, let me just ask one last question, and it's really a teaser for the EASA conference. So part of what we've talked about are individual programs. And we heard a little bit this morning about what the CAST is doing in promoting some of its activities in the regional aviation safety groups. But how do we promote these programs internationally so that we can ultimately up-level it and communicate across regions, across countries? Any thoughts on that? And are there any legal issues that we have to be worried about in that realm?
It was interesting. This is a topic that came up at our ICAO Council retreat on Friday and Saturday. And I think there's an emerging consensus on the need to better utilize the regional offices of ICAO, working in conjunction with the regional groups, recognizing, though, as a legal matter, each contracting state has the legal obligation to provide whatever Annex 6 oversight or 13 accident investigation or S&P in Annex 19, but the way they can demonstrate compliance is through these regional efforts, because we must recognize that we're extraordinarily safe in most parts of the world. We don't, an accident is both an existential event for a company and quite often a government, like Malaysia is experiencing right now, but that they're increasingly global events with global people on them with a demand to pool resources. So my advice would be, I can come up with a good argument that says this is both legal and appropriate, and more importantly, I think for myself and a lot of the colleagues at ICAO on the Council, they realize this is a very necessary, helpful way to go. Some regions are ahead of others. I'd say the RSGPA, Pan America, is ahead of others in safety information protection and what they're doing with you guys on ASIAS. Other parts of the world, Europe, of course, is very smartly moving forward because they have a construct that is a harmonized approach. But more can and will be done in that area, and I think that's going to be a focus of ICAO, John.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Ken. I think you got the last word.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
That's okay. I think that's great. I'd like to thank you all for an engaging conversation, and thank you, audience, for participating. John?
Well, it's really a privilege to have panelists of this caliber. I think, listening to some of the comments, clearly some very insightful observations from clearly folks that are in the middle of, they're really at the epicenter of this activity, and we're very, very privileged to have them here with us. Something that just got pointed out to me for those who are aware that we're webcasting this event today, we have 27 countries that are actually watching this right now. It includes China, Russia, Guyana, New Zealand, Argentina, and UAE, just to name a few. So that gives you an idea of the level of interest and outreach that this topic has. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a lunch break right now. John Betty from Flight Safety Foundation is going to be our featured speaker during the lunch. So what I would ask is that if everybody could be back in place by 12:45, doesn't mean you have to eat by 12:45, but if you could be in place so that we can give him our undivided attention. And one more time, I'd like to recognize our sponsors, Boeing, MITRE, Airbus, RAA, and A4A. Thank you so much for your support.